After the chaos of the First Crusade, when Jerusalem fell into Christian hands in 1099, the world expected stability, not secrecy. Yet within 2 decades, 9 obscure French knights appeared in the Holy City and made a request so strange that it still unsettles historians today. They asked not for land, riches, or titles, but permission to live in the ruins of Solomon's temple itself. In 1119, Hugues de Payan and his companions formed what would soon be called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. On paper, they were humble warrior monks. In reality, their mission remains dangerously unclear. The official story claims these men existed to protect pilgrims traveling the perilous roads of the Holy Land. But the numbers never made sense. 9 knights could not safeguard entire trade routes, and for years, no one even recorded their patrols. What is far more telling is where they were stationed. King Baldwin II granted them quarters directly on the Temple Mount, one of the most sensitive and symbolically charged sites on earth. Access to that ground was tightly controlled, yet the Templars were allowed to remain there in near silence, unseen and unquestioned. Almost immediately, the church showered them with privileges no order had ever received so quickly. They answered only to the Pope. They were exempt from taxes. They could cross borders freely. Such authority was unheard of, especially for an order that had yet to prove itself on the battlefield. It raises an uncomfortable question: what had they already proven before they were ever publicly known? Whispers soon followed them. Beneath the stones of Jerusalem, beneath the collapsed halls of an ancient temple, the knights were said to be searching, not guarding. Some chroniclers hinted at excavations carried out under cover of darkness. Others spoke of relics tied to the earliest foundations of Judaism and Christianity. No records describe what they found, if anything at all. But when the Templars finally emerged from the shadows, they were no longer poor, and they were no longer insignificant. Something had changed, and history never explained what. What the Knights Templar did beneath Solomon's temple is where history grows quiet and suspicion begins. For nearly a decade after their founding, the order left almost no trace in battle records, pilgrim accounts, or royal correspondence. Instead, their presence was concentrated in one place alone: the Temple Mount. Ancient sources describe the Templars living directly above a maze of sealed chambers, collapsed corridors, and forgotten vaults dating back thousands of years. It was there, far from public view, that the most unsettling questions emerge. Chroniclers from the period hint that the knights were not idle. Muslim and Christian observers alike noted unusual nighttime activity around the former temple complex. Tools were heard striking stone. Guards were posted not outward but inward, as if something below required protection. Official church records are silent on any excavation permits, yet the geography makes coincidence difficult to accept. If the Templars were merely praying and training, why did they need access to subterranean ruins long buried and deliberately sealed? Legends claim the knights were searching for objects tied to the earliest foundations of biblical history. Some point to the Ark of the Covenant, others speak of lost priestly texts, sacred geometries, or relics from the first temple that contradicted later doctrine. Whether these stories are exaggerated or suppressed is impossible to prove, because no inventories survive, no excavation logs, no recovery reports, only gaps where documentation should exist. What deepens the mystery is what happened next. Shortly after their long occupation of the Temple Mount ended, the Templars experienced a transformation that stunned medieval Europe. Donations flooded in. Noble families entrusted them with wealth, Kings borrowed from them. It was as if confidence in the order had been quietly manufactured at the highest levels of power. Something had been verified. Something had been transferred. Today, historians searching Vatican archives encounter strange absences surrounding these years. Correspondence references sealed items, unnamed discoveries, and materials redirected to Rome without description. The question that lingers is not just what the Templars may have found beneath Solomon's temple, but why the Church ensured the trail would never be followed. Some secrets, it seems, were never meant to surface again. The transformation was sudden, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. Within a single generation, the so-called poor Knights of Christ evolved into the most powerful organization in medieval Europe. Men who had once sworn vows of poverty now controlled fortresses, fleets, and treasuries stretching from Jerusalem to Paris, yet no conventional explanation accounts for how this happened so fast. The Templars did not conquer kingdoms, nor did they inherit dynasties. Their rise followed a different logic, one rooted in trust granted by forces far above ordinary politics. Nobles began donating land without hesitation. Kings deposited fortunes into Templar vaults, confident their wealth was safer with warrior monks than with crowns. The order developed advanced financial systems centuries ahead of their time, issuing letters of credit and moving vast sums invisibly across borders. Such innovation alone was extraordinary, but innovation does not explain immunity. The Templars were untouchable. They answered to no king, paid no taxes, and could defy local laws without consequence. Only the Pope held authority over them, and even that relationship appeared carefully balanced. What changed beneath Jerusalem now echoed across Europe. Whatever the Templars possessed inspired absolute confidence and quiet fear in equal measure. Rumors followed them of sacred knowledge, dangerous truths, and relics that validated their authority without ever being displayed. Gold could be counted, faith could be questioned, but certainty, once established, could not. And the Church watched this transformation closely. What had once been a useful order was becoming a parallel power structure, one anchored in something Rome itself did not fully control. And history shows that when influence grows faster than permission, it does not go unnoticed for long. The consequences of that imbalance would soon reshape Christendom, turning admiration into suspicion, loyalty into fear, and unchecked power fatal. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar had become something far more complex than holy warriors. To the Vatican, they were indispensable. The Church ruled souls, but the Templars moved money, information, and influence across borders no pope or king could openly cross. In an age where trust was rare and theft was constant, the Templars became the Church's most reliable instrument in a dangerous world. They pioneered systems that looked suspiciously like modern banking. Pilgrims could deposit gold in one city and retrieve its value thousands of miles away using coded documents only Templars could read. Kings borrowed from them to fund wars. Bishops used them to transfer church wealth discreetly. This made the order incredibly powerful, but also incredibly exposed. Every transaction carried information. Every delivery passed through Templar hands. The Vatican understood this and quietly depended on it. Beyond finance, the Templars functioned as eyes and ears. Their fortresses dotted key routes across Europe and the Holy Land. They heard confessions on the road, guarded sensitive envoys, and observed political tensions long before they erupted. Information flowed toward them naturally and from them selectively. What they reported to Rome and what they chose not to is largely unknown. Records hint at coded correspondence and verbal briefings never committed to parchment. As enforcers, they were equally valuable. When church authority was challenged, Templar intervention carried both military and symbolic weight. Their presence alone could end disputes, silence resistance, or protect assets deemed too important to risk failure. They operated with papal blessing, yet outside normal oversight, a combination that made them uniquely effective. But reliance breeds fear. The Vatican began to realize that the Templars were not just collecting wealth and intelligence, but also filtering it. Knowledge passed through them, and knowledge could be withheld. What began as trust slowly shifted into surveillance. Rome did not just use the Templars, it watched them. Because the most dangerous weapon is not force, but information controlled by someone else. Long before their fall, whispers followed the Knights Templar about objects they carried that were never meant to be seen. Not swords or coins, but knowledge fixed onto parchment, stone, and memory. Chroniclers describe maps unlike anything medieval Europe should have possessed, showing coastlines, land masses, and trade routes centuries ahead of accepted discovery. These charts were not decorative. They were precise, mathematical, and guarded with unusual secrecy. Alongside these maps were rumors of texts older than Christianity itself. Manuscripts attributed to early Jewish sects, Gnostic Christians, and forgotten Eastern traditions were said to circulate quietly within Templar commanderies. Some described alternative accounts of Christ's life. Others challenged the authority of Rome by suggesting spiritual knowledge once flowed freely without hierarchy or papal control. If true, such texts would not merely be heretical, they would be destabilizing. Relics deepened the unease. Objects recovered from the Holy Land appeared briefly in Templar custody before vanishing into sealed vaults. Unlike public relics, paraded to inspire devotion, these were hidden. That choice alone suggests danger. Relics are meant to be seen, secrets are not. The implication is unsettling. These items may have raised questions the Church could not safely answer. What alarms historians most is not the legends themselves, but the pattern of disappearance. References to these materials exist in letters, trial transcripts, and accusations, yet no surviving catalog confirms their contents. When the Templars were arrested, inquisitors demanded information about books and objects rather than gold. Knowledge, not wealth, was the focus. If the Templars truly possessed maps that redrew the world, texts that reshaped theology, and relics that blurred sacred boundaries, then their value was immeasurable. In that light, the Order's protection makes sense, and so does its destruction, because when truth threatens authority, it becomes the most dangerous treasure of all. And perhaps that is why accusations of heresy sounded hollow, while fear behind closed doors felt real. As Rome faced knowledge it could neither preach, control, nor erase, only bury deep beneath silence, archives, and centuries of questions left behind. When cooperation turned into fear, it did not happen with a declaration or a rupture, but with silence. The Vatican had relied on the Knights Templar for decades, trusting them with gold, roads, and secrets of state. But gradually, Rome began to sense that information was flowing in only one direction. Reports arrived incomplete, questions were answered indirectly, and beneath formal obedience lingered an unsettling independence. Church officials noticed contradictions they could not resolve. The Templars spoke with confidence on theological matters usually reserved for bishops. They referenced traditions older than canon law, sources that had no place in approved doctrine. Some inquisitors later hinted that Templar testimony felt rehearsed, as if built upon a shared internal truth invisible to outsiders. That alone was enough to raise alarm. The fear was not that the Templars were heretics in the conventional sense. It was worse. They appeared informed. Knowledge, once gathered, cannot be ungathered, and Rome understood this better than anyone. If the Templars had uncovered evidence that challenged apostolic succession, papal supremacy, or the carefully constructed narrative of early Christianity, then their very existence became a liability. Power structures survive on belief reinforced by authority. The Templars inverted that equation. Authority flowed toward them because belief followed knowledge. Pilgrims trusted them, nobles deferred to them. Even kings hesitated to confront them openly. To the Vatican, this represented a fracture forming within Christendom itself. From that moment, cooperation was no longer protection, it was exposure. Surveillance replaced trust. Dossiers replaced prayers. The question was no longer whether the Templars were useful, but whether they were safe to leave untouched. And once the Church concluded that certain truths could not be allowed to circulate, the path forward narrowed dramatically. History remembers the arrests as sudden. In reality, fear had been growing quietly for years. By the time action came, the decision was less about justice than containment, sealing knowledge away before it could ever fracture belief again and reshape the world permanently. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, an eerie stillness settled over Europe. In dozens of cities, across kingdoms separated by mountains and seas, royal agents moved at the same hour, carrying sealed orders they had been forbidden to open until that morning. The targets were identical everywhere. Knights Templar. No warnings were issued, no charges announced in advance. By nightfall, one of the most powerful organizations in Christendom had effectively ceased to exist. The precision was terrifying. Templar commanders were arrested in their sleep. Commanderies were locked down before anyone could flee. Records, keys, and sealed chests were seized simultaneously, as if the planners knew exactly where to look. This was not the chaos of political panic. It was the execution of a long-prepared design. Such coordination required months of planning, intelligence gathering, and cooperation across borders. Most unsettling of all, it required silence from Rome. Officially, the arrests were ordered by King Philip IV of France, a monarch deeply in debt to the Templars. But the scope of the operation makes it clear that a single king could not have acted alone. The order answered only to the Pope. No ruler had legal authority to arrest them without papal consent. And yet no immediate condemnation followed. The Vatican did not rush to their defense. Instead, it hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than any decree. As news spread, confusion turned to fear. The roads went quiet. Fortresses once considered untouchable were suddenly vulnerable. Men who had protected pilgrims and kings alike were now dragged in chains, accused before they could even speak. Observers noted how quickly church courts adapted to the arrests, as if prepared in advance. Questions that should have been asked were already ignored. For ordinary people, it felt like the world had shifted overnight. An order that symbolized stability vanished without resistance. No battle was fought, no siege occurred. The silence itself became the message. Whatever the Templars possessed, whatever they knew, it was dangerous enough that speed mattered more than justice. And in that frozen morning, as bells rang and doors closed, history took a turn that could never be undone. When the accusations against the Knights Templar were finally revealed, Confusion spread almost as quickly as fear. The charges were not political crimes or financial corruption, which might have made sense given the order's power and wealth. Instead, they were accusations so strange, so grotesque, that even medieval observers struggled to believe them. The Templars were accused of spitting on the cross, worshipping a demon called Baphomet, engaging in obscene initiation rituals, and denying Christ himself. These were not minor deviations. They were absolute spiritual crimes. What puzzled contemporaries was how abruptly these claims appeared. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had been celebrated as defenders of the faith. They prayed publicly, fought under the cross, and enjoyed papal endorsement unmatched by any other order. No widespread rumors of heresy followed them before 1307. No theological disputes had ever escalated to formal warnings. Then suddenly, the Church claimed the rot had always been there. The extremity of the accusations raises an uncomfortable question. Why were such unbelievable charges necessary? Political or financial motives could have justified trials and reforms. Heresy, however, justified annihilation. Once labeled enemies of God, the Templars lost all protection, sympathy, and credibility. Their property could be seized. Their voices could be ignored. Their history could be rewritten. Even more suspicious is how vague many of the charges were. No consistent description of Baphomet existed. Ritual details changed from testimony to testimony. Some accusations contradicted basic Christian practice the Templars followed openly for decades. It was as if the charges were designed not to be proven but to shock, confuse, and overwhelm. Historians now suspect these allegations served a specific purpose. By framing the Templars as spiritually corrupt, attention was pulled away from more dangerous questions. Questions about documents seized, about sealed chests, about knowledge the order may have possessed. Heresy created noise. Noise buried truth. And in the chaos, logic mattered less than fear. Because when accusations make no sense, it often means they were never meant to. Once the charges were declared, the outcome was no longer uncertain. What followed was not an investigation, but a process designed to produce agreement. Across France and beyond, imprisoned Templars were subjected to interrogations that blurred quickly into torture. The methods were brutal, even by medieval standards. Men were stretched on racks, burned, starved, and threatened with death, unless they confirmed the accusations placed before them, and under that pressure, many did. The confessions that emerged followed a disturbing pattern. Details mirrored one another too closely, as if guided by leading questions rather than memory. When interrogators asked about denying Christ, the answer appeared. When they demanded descriptions of idols, something was invented. Yet when torture ceased, many Templars recanted immediately, insisting their earlier statements were false. That inconsistency alone should have invalidated the testimony. Instead, it was ignored. What matters most is what was never asked. Interrogators showed little interest in the order's finances, its archives, or the years spent beneath the Temple Mount. They did not press for explanations of missing records or sealed containers. Their focus remained fixed on spiritual crimes that could be theatrically condemned. The truth, it seems, was not the goal. Confirmation was. Some church officials quietly expressed discomfort. Papal envoys reported that confessions obtained under torture were unreliable. Even Pope Clement V hesitated, questioning whether the evidence justified such sweeping condemnation. But by then, the machinery was in motion. Public belief had shifted. Fear had done its work. The confessions served their purpose. They transformed uncertainty into narrative. Once spoken, the words could be repeated, cited, and archived, regardless of how they were obtained. History would remember the Templars not as defenders of Christendom, but as fallen heretics. And in that transformation, the most important questions were buried. Torture extracted obedience, not truth. Whatever knowledge the Templars possessed remained unspoken, locked behind pain, silence, and the flames that would soon follow. When the Knights Templar were arrested, the operation did not end with chains and interrogations. It continued quietly, efficiently, and with an urgency that suggests something far more valuable than punishment was at stake. Across Europe and the Holy Land, Templar commanderies were sealed, their doors broken open by royal officials and church representatives acting in unnerving coordination. What followed was the largest seizure of property in medieval history, and almost immediately, the records stopped making sense. Officially, the Templars possessed immense wealth. Lands, farms, vineyards, fortresses, horses, weapons, and gold were all cataloged, at least in theory, but contemporaries noticed something strange. Many commanderies were reported as nearly empty. Vaults, described as full just weeks earlier, contained little more than dust. Ships linked to the order vanished from ports before arrests began. Entire treasuries were rumored to have disappeared overnight, leaving investigators confused and suspicious. Some historians argue this proves the Templars had advance warning. Others believe the truth is more unsettling. The seizures focused heavily on documents, keys, and sealed containers rather than visible riches. Chests were removed without being opened publicly. Items were marked for transfer without description. Witnesses later testified that wagons left Templar sites under armed guard, heading not toward royal treasuries but toward church-controlled destinations. Even King Philip, deeply indebted to the order, seemed frustrated. Despite the scale of the operation, the wealth recovered failed to resolve his financial crisis. If the Templars truly controlled the fortune history attributes to them, where was it? The answer offered by official records is vague at best. Assets were reassigned, redistributed, or absorbed into other orders, but the numbers never aligned. Too much was missing. What haunts historians is not simply the loss of wealth, but the absence of transparency. Confiscations on this scale should have generated exhaustive inventories. Instead, gaps dominate the paperwork. Pages are missing. Descriptions are incomplete. Some properties vanish from records entirely. It suggests that the most important assets were never meant to be counted. If gold had been the prize, it would have been displayed. If land were the goal, it would have been claimed openly. But secrecy surrounded the confiscation itself, and secrecy implies selection. Whatever vanished overnight may have been too sensitive, too powerful, or too dangerous to ever be acknowledged again. When the Vatican finally moved to formalize the seizure of Templar property, it did so with the language of order and legality. Papal bulls listed lands, churches, farms, and revenues transferred to church control or reassigned to the Hospitallers. On parchment, everything appeared methodical. Gold was weighed, estates were named, rights were reassigned, yet the very precision of these records highlights what they avoid mentioning. Certain items appear only as vague references. Chests without contents. Containers sealed and forwarded, vaults acknowledged but never described. In multiple dioceses, officials recorded receiving materials of the temple with no further explanation. For an institution obsessed with documentation, such omissions are striking. Medieval church bureaucracy cataloged candles and linens, yet here it offered silence. Even more telling is what inquisitors asked about during trials. They repeatedly questioned Templars about books, relics, and hidden objects, not simply money. Gold could be traced, land could be reclaimed, but knowledge required control. When witnesses spoke of underground storage, secret rooms, or sealed archives, those testimonies were removed from public summaries. Some confiscated items were sent directly to Rome under papal authority, bypassing local courts and kings entirely. Their destination is known, their contents are not. Later inventories list nothing corresponding to these transfers. It is as if entire categories of property vanished between receipt and record. The Vatican has always maintained that it took only material wealth, yet the paperwork tells a different story, one shaped by absence rather than clarity. The Church documented what could be shown and erased what could not. What remains is a carefully curated record that accounts for gold and land while leaving unanswered questions about what required seals, secrecy, and silence. If something demanded omission, it was never meant to be understood outside the walls of Rome. And in that gap between ink and reality, historians glimpse a deliberate act of concealment, suggesting that the most valuable Templar assets were never meant to exist on any list kept from human memory. As the years passed and the dust of the Templar trials settled, scholars began to notice something deeply troubling in the historical record. For an event as vast as the destruction of the Knights Templar, the paperwork should have been overwhelming. Thousands of arrests, hundreds of properties, centuries of accumulated wealth. Yet when historians trace the confiscation process through surviving Vatican and royal archives, they encounter not clarity, but voids. Entire inventories are missing, others end abruptly, mid-sentence, as if deliberately unfinished. Some lists reference prior documents that no longer exist. In certain regions, records of Templar holdings simply stop, replaced by vague statements claiming assets were handled according to papal instruction. No explanation follows, no accounting remains. This is not the normal decay of history. Medieval church archives preserve tax disputes, wine deliveries, and minor land transfers in meticulous detail. The absence here is selective. It clusters around specific years, specific commanderies, and specific categories of material. Items described as sealed, hidden, or recovered privately appear in testimony but vanish from final summaries. The result is a paper trail that looks intentionally interrupted. What makes this even more unsettling is that later, church officials seemed aware of the problem. Subsequent inquiries into Templar assets quietly acknowledged discrepancies without attempting to resolve them. The question of missing property was never fully reopened. It was allowed to fade. Silence became policy. Some historians argue the losses can be explained by corruption or chaos, but corruption leaves traces. Chaos produces contradictions. Here there is neither. Instead, there is consistency in omission. The same types of assets disappear everywhere, regardless of region or ruler. That suggests coordination, not negligence. The missing inventory problem forces a stark conclusion. Something was removed before it could be counted, or counted and then erased. And whatever it was, it did not belong to kings, courts, or even public doctrine. It belonged to a deeper level of authority, one that understood the danger of leaving certain things written down, because what is never recorded can never be demanded back, questioned openly, or proven to have existed at all. Once the material trail of the Knights Templar dissolved, speculation rushed in to fill the silence. Not idle fantasy, but questions born from gaps too large to ignore. If entire inventories vanished and sealed items were redirected to Rome without description, then what exactly required such extreme discretion? For centuries, one possibility has refused to disappear: that the Templars uncovered relics capable of shattering the foundations of Christian history. Foremost among these is the Ark of the Covenant. Ancient texts place it within Solomon's temple, directly above the ground the Templars occupied for years. The Ark was not merely symbolic, it represented divine authority itself, a physical object tied to God's covenant with Israel. If the Templars found it, the implications would have been catastrophic. Possession of the Ark would shift spiritual legitimacy away from Rome, undermining centuries of theology built on apostolic succession rather than sacred artifacts. Then there is the Holy Grail. While later mythologized, early interpretations describe it not as a chalice, but as a lineage, a knowledge tradition, or even proof that Christ's story had been altered. Some medieval sources link the Templars to Grail legends, emerging suddenly in the same regions where the order was strongest. The timing is difficult to dismiss. Stories appeared where secrets were rumored to exist. Other relics are even harder to define. Objects tied to Mary Magdalene, texts describing Christ as teacher rather than sacrifice. Artifacts suggesting early Christianity was one path among many, not a divinely exclusive truth. These ideas would not merely challenge doctrine, they would dissolve the Church's claim to absolute authority. What makes these theories linger is not proof, but reaction. The Vatican never addressed such claims directly. Instead, it erased the order linked to them and sealed the evidence away. Relics meant to inspire faith were hidden. Knowledge meant to clarify belief was buried. If the Templars discovered nothing, such drastic measures make little sense. But if they found even fragments of a truth too powerful to control, then history's most extreme response becomes suddenly logical. The unthinkable possibility remains that Christianity itself was not under attack from outside forces, but from its own forgotten origins, briefly uncovered, then sealed away before belief could collapse under the weight of truth. As rumors of relics swirled, an even more dangerous possibility emerged, one that terrified the Church far more than any physical object. The Knights Templar were believed to possess texts, not copies of Scripture, but writings excluded, suppressed, or erased during the earliest centuries of Christianity. Manuscripts that told a different story of Christ, faith, and authority itself. Early Christianity was not a single, unified belief system. It was a fractured landscape of sects, teachers, and interpretations, many of which Rome later labeled heretical. Gnostic writings, Jewish Christian gospels, and Eastern philosophies once circulated freely before councils determined what would be canon and what would be destroyed. If the Templars recovered such texts in the Holy Land, especially beneath Jerusalem, they would have held evidence that Christian doctrine was shaped by choice, not divine inevitability. Some alleged manuscripts portrayed Christ as a spiritual teacher rather than a divine sacrifice. Others emphasized personal enlightenment over obedience to hierarchy. A few questioned the necessity of priests altogether. These ideas were not merely theological disagreements. They threatened the entire structure of the Church, which derived power from mediation between humanity and God. During the trials, inquisitors repeatedly asked about secret books, private readings, and forbidden teachings. The obsession was clear. Gold could fund wars, but ideas could start revolutions. When Templars denied possessing such texts, torture intensified, suggesting the interrogators believed something existed that had not yet been surrendered. The line between heresy and truth is drawn by those in power. What Rome called dangerous doctrine may have been closer to Christianity's earliest form than the approved Gospels themselves. If the Templars had proof of that, it would explain everything: the fear, the secrecy, and the urgency to erase the order completely. The most unsettling thought is this: these texts may not have been false, they may have been inconvenient, and in the struggle between preserving authority and preserving truth, history suggests the choice was already made. The knowledge was labeled heresy, sealed away and forgotten, leaving behind only whispers that something vital to understanding Christianity itself was deliberately lost. If the Knights Templar truly possessed relics or texts capable of challenging Christian authority, the most telling detail is not their discovery, but their disappearance. History is filled with powerful objects seized by conquerors and proudly displayed to legitimize victory. Yet in this case, nothing was revealed. No relics were paraded, no manuscripts debated publicly. Silence followed, and that silence has endured for more than 7 centuries. The Church has always understood the power of sacred objects. Relics were tools of faith, used to inspire devotion, attract pilgrims, and reinforce doctrine. If the Vatican had acquired items that strengthened its narrative, they would have been showcased without hesitation. Their absence suggests the opposite. These were not objects that could be explained away or reinterpreted safely. They carried meanings that resisted control. Some historians argue the relics never existed, but that explanation fails to account for the extraordinary measures taken to suppress discussion. Trial records reference unnamed objects. Testimonies mention sealed containers removed under papal authority. Correspondence hints at materials deemed unsuitable for public handling. These fragments point not to fantasy, but to deliberate concealment. Another possibility is that the objects were destroyed, yet destruction leaves traces. Orders are recorded, condemnations are written. Here again, the archives are silent. It is more likely the relics were hidden, absorbed into the deepest layers of church custody, where access is restricted not by time, but by authority. Secrecy in this context becomes an admission. To hide something forever is to acknowledge its power. If these objects challenge the church's version of Christ, of salvation, or of divine authority, then allowing them to surface would risk unraveling belief itself. Faith depends not only on devotion, but on narrative stability. The relics never reappeared because their existence posed a question that could not be answered without consequence. What if Christianity's foundations were not as singular or as controlled as Rome claimed? Rather than confront that possibility, history suggests it was locked away. The danger was not disbelief, but doubt, and doubt, once introduced, cannot be confiscated, only delayed, waiting patiently in the shadows of history. By the time the Knights Templar were formally brought before church councils, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The trials were presented as a search for truth. But every step reveals a process shaped by pressure long before evidence was weighed. Kings demanded resolution, debts demanded erasure, and the church found itself trapped between moral authority and political survival. King Philip IV of France exerted relentless force. He controlled the prisons, the interrogators, and much of the narrative circulating among the public. His financial desperation was no secret, and the Templars represented both a solution and a threat. Allowing them to survive intact meant acknowledging his dependence. Destroying them meant freedom from obligation. Rome could not ignore this reality. Pope Clement V hesitated publicly, but privately he faced an impossible choice. Defending the Templars risked open conflict with the most powerful monarch in Europe. Condemning them meant endorsing evidence he knew was compromised. Documents later uncovered suggest Clement sought a quiet dissolution, not annihilation. But compromise collapsed under political weight. Councils convened not to debate innocence, but to determine procedure. Testimony extracted under torture was accepted despite church law forbidding it. Contradictions were overlooked. Recantations were dismissed. In many cases, the accused were denied meaningful defense. This was not justice delayed, it was justice redirected. What becomes clear is that the trials served a function beyond guilt or innocence. They provided legitimacy. Once the church issued a verdict, even a flawed one, the narrative was sealed. Heresy explained everything. Confiscation became righteous. Silence became obedience. The verdict was written not in courtrooms, but in correspondence, debts, and fears exchanged behind closed doors. The Templars were not condemned because the evidence was overwhelming. They were condemned because uncertainty itself was dangerous. And in moments when truth threatens to destabilize power, institutions often choose finality over fairness. The trial was never meant to reveal what the Templars were guilty of. It was meant to ensure they could never speak again. Behind the public declarations and official condemnations, Pope Clement V wrestled with doubts he never fully voiced. Unlike kings and inquisitors, the Pope had access to the complete picture: the confessions obtained under torture, the contradictory testimonies, the sudden emergence of charges after decades of unquestioned loyalty. And what he saw did not align with certainty. It troubled him deeply. Private correspondence reveals a man torn between conscience and consequence. Clement questioned the reliability of the evidence, openly acknowledging that many confessions had been forced. He delayed formal judgment repeatedly, requesting further inquiry, ordering pauses, and attempting to assert papal authority over proceedings that were already spiraling beyond his control. These delays were not procedural accidents. They were hesitation. At one point, papal envoys reported that when torture stopped, many Templars retracted their statements and reaffirmed their faith. According to church law, such recantations should have invalidated earlier confessions. Clement knew this, yet invoking that law would have meant confronting King Philip directly, risking schism, and exposing the church's vulnerability to secular power. The Pope also understood the implications of what the Templars might have possessed. His doubts were not limited to legal procedure. They extended to knowledge. If the order had uncovered materials capable of destabilizing doctrine, then acquitting them publicly could invite questions Rome was not prepared to answer. Silence, in that sense, became a form of damage control. Ultimately, Clement chose a path of compromise. He did not declare the Templars guilty of heresy outright. Instead, he dissolved the order by provision, citing scandal rather than proof. It was a carefully worded decision, one that avoided affirming the charges while still erasing the institution. The Pope's doubts never altered the outcome, but they haunt the record. They suggest that at the highest level of the Church, belief in the Templars' guilt was far from absolute, and that makes their destruction even more unsettling, because it implies the decision was not driven by truth, but by fear of what might happen if doubt itself were allowed to survive. When the final decisions were made, the most powerful tool used against the Knights Templar was not fire or chains, but silence. Once the order was dissolved, discussion ended abruptly. Appeals were ignored. Questions went unanswered. The surviving Templars were scattered, imprisoned, or absorbed into other institutions under strict conditions that ensured they could never speak collectively again. Truth did not need to be disproven. It only needed to be muted. Those who recanted their confessions were treated most harshly. By insisting on their innocence, and they threatened the fragile narrative holding the trials together. Many were condemned as relapsed heretics and executed swiftly, their deaths serving as warnings rather than justice. Others were sentenced to life imprisonment, effectively erased from public memory. Their voices vanished behind monastery walls and unmarked graves. The Church controlled the historical record with equal precision. Trial documents were edited. Testimonies were summarized selectively. References to missing objects, secret texts, or contradictions were removed or buried in inaccessible archives. What remained was a simplified story that could be repeated safely. The Templars had fallen into corruption, and the Church had acted to protect the faith. Silence extended beyond individuals. Entire questions were forbidden. Why had the arrests been so coordinated? Why were inventories incomplete? Why did the Pope avoid declaring clear guilt? These uncertainties were never addressed because addressing them risked reopening doubt, and doubt was the one thing the Church could not afford to let spread. Over time, silence did its work. Generations passed. The complexity faded. What survived was a legend stripped of nuance, framed as cautionary tale rather than unresolved mystery. Yet silence leaves traces of its own, gaps in records, abrupt endings, stories that stop without conclusion. In the end, the destruction of the Knights Templar was not sealed by flames, but by control over memory. By deciding what would be recorded, repeated, and remembered, the Church ensured that whatever truths the Templars carried died with them, or at least disappeared from view. Because the most effective way to bury dangerous knowledge is not to destroy it, but to make the world forget it ever existed. On a cold evening in March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood bound on a small island in the Seine as flames were prepared beneath his feet. He had been imprisoned for 7 years, forced to watch his order erased piece by piece. That night was meant to end the story quietly. Instead, it ensured the Templars would never be forgotten. Moments before the fire was lit, de Molay did something unexpected. He withdrew his earlier confession, publicly declaring the charges against the Templars false. He proclaimed the order innocent, the trials corrupt, and the accusations born of lies. For Church and Crown alike, this was dangerous. A recantation at the moment of death shattered the carefully constructed narrative of guilt. There was no time for another trial. The sentence was carried out immediately. As the flames rose, witnesses recorded de Molay issuing what later became known as a curse. He called upon God to judge those responsible for the destruction of the order, and summoned Pope Clement XIII and King Philip V to answer before divine justice within a year. Medieval crowds believed words spoken at death carried power. This was not rage. It sounded deliberate, measured, and final. What followed gave the curse its weight. Pope Clement died just over a month later, struck down by sudden illness. King Philip died before the year ended, his reign collapsing into chaos. To contemporaries, the sequence felt unnatural. To skeptics, coincidence. But even today, historians acknowledge how deeply these deaths shaped the legend. The curse reframed de Molay's execution. No longer a defeated heretic, he appeared as a man silenced because he knew too much. His final words echoed the unresolved questions left behind. If the Templars were truly guilty, why did the truth need fire to survive? And if they were innocent, what exactly died with him in those flames? The destruction of the Knights Templar was designed to be total, but history rarely obeys intentions so cleanly. Almost immediately after the arrests, rumors surfaced that not everything had been seized. Some Templars had vanished before Friday the 13th. Certain ships were missing from ports. Entire commanderies were found strangely empty, as if their most important contents had already been removed. These rumors hardened into theories that something had been smuggled out in the final days. Not gold, or at least not only gold, but documents, relics, and knowledge too dangerous to fall into hostile hands. The speed of the arrests suggests surprise, yet the gaps in confiscated assets suggest preparation. It raises the possibility that warnings were delivered quietly, selectively by allies who understood what was truly at risk. Legends point to hidden vaults scattered across Europe. Remote castles, mountain monasteries, and underground chambers are said to have received sealed chests under cover of darkness. Scotland, Portugal, and parts of Spain feature prominently in these accounts. Regions where papal authority was weaker and local rulers were less eager to enforce Rome's will. In Portugal, the Templars were not destroyed at all, but reborn as the Order of Christ, their assets and influence largely preserved under a new name. What makes these theories persistent is not romance, but continuity. Advanced architectural knowledge, unusual financial practices, and symbolic traditions appear in places linked to former Templar strongholds long after the order's fall. Something survived, whether fragments of doctrine, practical systems, or guarded truths. The transfer feels intentional. Critics dismiss the idea of hidden knowledge as myth, yet myths rarely align so closely with documented absences. If nothing escaped, the silence should be complete. Instead, history whispers. The possibility remains that the most sensitive Templar secrets were never captured, never cataloged, and never destroyed. They were moved, protected, and entrusted to silence. If so, the fire that consumed the order did not end its purpose. It merely forced it underground, where survival depended not on banners or vows, but on memory, discretion, and the understanding that some truths endure only by remaining unseen. When the Knights Templar were officially dissolved, history recorded an ending. But beneath that ending, signs of continuation quietly emerged. Orders do not simply vanish when their members' resources and knowledge remain scattered across continents. What followed was not resurrection in name, but survival in fragments, adapted to a world that had proven hostile. In several regions, former Templars were absorbed into new or existing institutions with remarkable ease. In Portugal, the transition was almost seamless. The Order of Christ inherited Templar properties, personnel, and influence with papal approval. Its symbols changed, but its structure endured. Members who should have been erased instead found shelter, continuing their work under a different banner. This was not defiance, it was strategic compliance. Elsewhere, survival was quieter. Individual knights retreated into monasteries, guilds, or royal service. Some disappeared into obscurity, carrying knowledge no one could safely ask about. Others maintained discreet networks, bound not by public vows, but by shared memory. The Brotherhood no longer needed hierarchy, it needed only continuity. Symbols tell part of the story. Templar imagery appears centuries later in unexpected places, carved into stone, embedded in rituals, echoed in financial and architectural practices that feel out of place for their time. These are not proofs, but they are patterns, and patterns suggest intention. The idea of a hidden survival unsettles historians because it resists closure. It implies that the Church's victory was incomplete, that while the institution was destroyed, its essence adapted. Knowledge does not require armies. It requires preservation, and preservation thrives in secrecy. If fragments of the Templars endured, they did so with a lesson learned at terrible cost. Visibility invites destruction. Silence ensures survival. The Brotherhood that once stood openly beneath the cross may have chosen a different path, one where influence moved quietly and truth waited patiently. The fire that ended the Templars did not consume everything they were. It forced transformation. And somewhere between myth and history lies the possibility that the order never truly died. It simply learned how to disappear. At the heart of Vatican City lies a place long surrounded by myth, reverence, and unease. For centuries, it was known as the Vatican Secret Archives, a name that alone suggested hidden truths and forbidden knowledge. Though officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the change did little to quiet speculation. The doors remain locked to all but a select few, and the restrictions surrounding its contents are among the strictest in the world. Within these walls are miles of shelving, containing correspondence, trial records, and internal memoranda spanning nearly 2,000 years. Among them lie documents related to the Knights Templar, preserved not as public history, but as controlled material. Access is granted only to vetted scholars, and even then, only to carefully selected files. Entire categories remain sealed, their existence acknowledged but unexplored. What troubles historians is not simply the secrecy, but its persistence. 700 years have passed since the Templars were destroyed. Empires have risen and fallen. Doctrines have evolved. Yet restrictions remain in place, suggesting that whatever these documents contain still carries perceived risk. If the story were settled, the archives could speak freely. They do not. Occasionally, fragments escape into public view. References to sealed chests, mentions of unlisted materials transferred under papal authority, letters marked for restricted circulation, even among senior clergy. These hints imply layers of classification, as if some knowledge was deemed dangerous not just in the 14th century, but indefinitely. The Vatican maintains that restrictions exist to preserve context, prevent misinterpretation, and protect fragile materials. Yet other archives manage openness without catastrophe. The difference here is not preservation, it is control. Locked doors invite questions. What truths require protection from the modern world? What narratives could unravel if examined without filters? The continued secrecy surrounding Templar records suggests that the past has not finished speaking, and that what it has to say may still challenge authority. Until those doors fully open, history remains incomplete, and in that silence, suspicion thrives. Because when truth is locked away for centuries, it ceases to look like caution and begins to resemble fear. From time to time, the Vatican offers glimpses into its past, releasing carefully selected documents meant to demonstrate transparency. When limited Templar records were made public, expectations were high. Instead of clarity, they delivered frustration, Pages arrived heavily redacted, sections missing, names removed, and entire passages summarized rather than shown, creating more questions than answers. Some documents confirmed what historians already suspected. The trials were rushed, evidence inconsistent, and papal authority strained. Others hinted at materials received directly by Rome that never entered standard inventories. References appeared to objects transferred for special consideration, a phrase never defined. Scholars searching for context found only silence where explanation should have been. What stands out most is the pattern of omission. Financial records are relatively complete. Legal decrees are preserved in detail. Yet anything touching on discoveries, internal debates, or theological concern fades into abstraction. Marginal notes disappear. Attachments referenced in letters are gone. It is not random loss. It is selective survival. Even more unsettling is how these releases are framed. They are presented as closure, as if the mystery has been resolved. Yet the redactions ensure it cannot be. By controlling what is revealed, the Vatican controls interpretation. The public sees fragments, never the whole. Historians accustomed to damaged archives recognize decay, but decay leaves chaos. Here there is order. Documents end cleanly where danger might begin. Names vanish when responsibility might be traced. Language softens when conflict might emerge. The result is a curated history, one that acknowledges mistakes while shielding deeper truths. Each release reminds scholars not of what is known, but of what remains withheld. And in that gap, the suspicion endures that the most important Templar records were never lost at all. They were simply never meant to be read until full access exists. Every redaction functions as evidence itself, signaling fear, unresolved conflict, and the enduring possibility that withheld documents still guard truths capable of unsettling modern belief systems and authority today. 7 centuries is a long time for secrets to lose their power. Documents age, institutions change, beliefs evolve. And yet, when it comes to the Knights Templar, classification remains. Certain materials are still restricted, their contents unavailable even to trusted scholars. The question is no longer what was hidden then, but why it remains hidden now. Normally, time dissolves danger. Medieval scandals become academic curiosities. Political embarrassments turn into footnotes. But Templar-related restrictions suggest something different. The Vatican does not treat these documents as relics of a settled past, but as active liabilities. That distinction matters. It implies relevance. What could still threaten the Church after hundreds of years? Not gold, not land, not even proof of procedural injustice. Those realities are already acknowledged. The only things capable of enduring danger are ideas, narratives, evidence that challenges foundational assumptions rather than surface events. If certain documents contain alternative accounts of early Christianity, proof of doctrinal manipulation, or records of relics that contradict accepted theology, releasing them would not simply revise history, it would destabilize belief. Faith depends on continuity. Break that continuity and authority weakens. Classification also protects precedent. If the Church admits to suppressing truth once, it invites scrutiny elsewhere. Questions multiply. What else was edited? What else was buried? Silence, therefore, becomes defensive, not against the past, but against the future. Some argue the secrecy is unnecessary, a relic of institutional caution. But institutions abandon caution when risk disappears. The fact that restrictions remain suggests unresolved tension. Something within those archives resists exposure. What stays classified after 700 years is rarely trivial. It is protected because it still matters. And that realization reframes the entire Templar story. Perhaps the danger was never confined to medieval Europe. Perhaps it persists, waiting in sealed folders and locked rooms, a reminder that some truths do not expire. They simply wait, patient and undisturbed, until someone finally decides the world is ready to hear them. When the Knights Templar disappeared, their castles burned and their banners fell, but the systems they built did not vanish with them. Long before modern banks existed, the Templars had created a financial network that allowed wealth to move invisibly across borders, protected by trust, codes, and reputation rather than force. Their destruction left a vacuum, and vacuums rarely remain empty for long. Pilgrims once deposited gold with the Templars in Europe and retrieved its value in the Holy Land using encrypted documents. Kings borrowed enormous sums to fund wars, confident the order could safeguard and transfer resources more efficiently than any crown. This was not simple money lending. It was systemic finance, built on records, verification, and credibility. When the order was dismantled, these methods did not die. They migrated. In the aftermath, former Templar assets and expertise flowed into other institutions. The Hospitallers inherited property. Royal treasuries absorbed financial practices. In Portugal, the Order of Christ retained both infrastructure and knowledge almost intact. Over time, similar systems appeared across Europe, embedded within emerging banks and state institutions. The resemblance is difficult to ignore. Some historians argue this evolution was inevitable. But inevitability does not explain precision. The speed with which advanced financial mechanisms reappeared suggests continuity rather than reinvention. Knowledge survived because it was useful and because it was never condemned. What makes this legacy unsettling is its origin. These systems were not born from commerce alone, but from an order suspected of holding forbidden knowledge. Finance was a tool, but control of information was the foundation. Trust, once centralized, becomes power. Modern banking rests on principles the Templars refined: abstraction of value, centralized authority, and invisible movement of wealth. Whether by inheritance or inspiration, the echo remains. The order was destroyed, but its design endured. If the Church feared what the Templars knew, it may have underestimated what they built, because while relics can be hidden and texts sealed away, systems survive by adapting. And in the structures that govern wealth today, some see not coincidence, but the faint outline of a medieval order that never truly lost its influence, only its name. Long after the Knights Templar were erased from official history, their symbols refused to vanish. Crosses, sigils, architectural motifs, and ritual patterns associated with the order began appearing in places and periods where they should not have existed, not as direct continuations, but as echoes, fragments embedded quietly into new contexts. To some, this is coincidence. To others, it feels deliberate. The Templar cross itself reemerged repeatedly, altered slightly, renamed but recognizable to those who knew its origin. It appeared on the sails of Portuguese explorers, on the banners of successor orders, and etched into stonework across Europe. These were not nostalgic decorations. Symbols carry meaning, especially in traditions that value secrecy. They function as markers of identity, recognition, and continuity. Architecture tells a similar story. Circular churches modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, favored by the Templars, continued to be built after the order's fall. Unusual geometries, sacred ratios, and alignments reappear in structures linked to former Templar territories. Such designs required specialized knowledge. That knowledge did not vanish with the trials. Even rituals hint at survival. Ceremonies emphasizing initiation, silence, and symbolic death echo elements attributed to the Templars during their persecution. Though later absorbed into guilds, fraternal orders, and knightly traditions, the resemblance is difficult to dismiss. These practices suggest transmission, not invention. Critics argue that medieval symbolism was widespread and easily borrowed. Yet borrowing does not explain persistence in specific lineages, nor does it explain why certain symbols re-emerged only where Templar influence had once been strongest. Patterns follow people, not myths. Symbols endure because they can travel unnoticed. They attract no trials, demand no explanations, and provoke no immediate fear. Yet they preserve memory. If fragments of the Templar Brotherhood survived, symbols would have been their safest inheritance. The disappearance of the order did not erase its identity, it scattered it, and in the symbols that quietly resurfaced across centuries, some historians glimpse a silent language, one that carried forward allegiance, knowledge, and recognition without ever needing to announce its presence openly again. As the fragments of Templar influence reappear across centuries, historians are left with a question that refuses to settle. Are these connections merely coincidence or evidence of deliberate continuation? Patterns alone do not prove intent, but repetition across time, geography, and structure demands scrutiny. When similar systems, symbols, and hierarchies emerge from the same historical source, coincidence becomes harder to defend. Power structures rarely reinvent themselves from nothing. They evolve, inheriting what works and discarding what attracts danger. The Templars learned this lesson brutally. Their destruction was not caused by weakness, but visibility. If any part of the order survived, logic suggests it would have abandoned overt identity while preserving function. Influence would move quietly, embedded within institutions that appeared legitimate and unthreatening. Modern organizations that emphasize centralized authority, layered secrecy, initiation-based advancement, and symbolic continuity mirror traits once attributed to the Templars. Banking systems, fraternal orders, and even state bureaucracies display structural similarities that feel more intentional than accidental. These systems do not claim Templar descent, yet they operate on principles the order perfected centuries earlier. Skeptics warn against overreach. Human societies repeat patterns because problems recur. Trust, governance, and finance demand similar solutions across eras. But this explanation falters when repetition aligns so closely with specific historical pathways. The same regions where Templars vanished are often where successor structures flourished first. If continuation exists, it is not conspiratorial in nature. It is practical. Knowledge survives because it is useful. Methods persist because they work. And memory endures because someone chooses to carry it forward. The question is not whether the Templars rule the modern world. It is whether their ideas were too effective to be destroyed. If so, the trials ended an institution, not a legacy. History often hides continuity beneath change. Names fall away, symbols adapt, but structure remains. And when examined closely, some of the world's most powerful systems appear less like fresh creations and more like echoes. The faint outline of a medieval order lingers not as domination, but as design. Whether that is coincidence or continuation, depends on how much silence one is willing to mistake for absence. After centuries of investigation, speculation, and silence, the central contradiction of the Templar story remains unresolved. If the Knights Templar were destroyed merely for their wealth, then history does not add up. Gold can be seized, land can be redistributed, debts can be erased. None of those actions require secrecy that lasts 700 years. None demand fabricated charges of heresy, mass torture, or the complete erasure of an order's voice. Something else was at stake. Kings have always targeted wealthy institutions, but they rarely cloak greed in theology unless fear demands it. King Philip could have accused the Templars of financial crimes, mismanagement, or political disobedience. Any of those charges would have sufficed. Instead, the narrative chosen was spiritual corruption, the most extreme accusation available. Heresy justified not only confiscation, but annihilation. That choice reveals motive. Gold does not threaten belief. Knowledge does. Ideas reshape authority in ways wealth never can. If the Templars possessed information that challenged the Church's version of Christian origins, divine authority, or historical continuity, then fear becomes understandable. The danger was not rebellion, but revelation, a truth that could not be debated without consequence. The Church's actions reflect this fear. Documents were sealed, inventories vanished, trials focused on belief rather than evidence. Even the Pope avoided declaring outright guilt, choosing silence over certainty. These are not the behaviors of an institution protecting assets. They are the behaviors of an institution protecting narrative control. History shows that when power rests on a story, anything capable of rewriting that story becomes existentially dangerous. The Templars, once trusted absolutely, crossed an invisible line. Whatever they learned shifted them from servants of authority to potential rivals. If it had been only gold, the Church could have taken it openly and moved on. Instead, it chose destruction wrapped in silence. That choice exposes fear far deeper than financial anxiety. It suggests that the true treasure was never something that could be weighed or counted. It was something that, once known, could never be taken back. Whatever the Vatican seized from the Knights Templar did not follow the normal path of confiscated wealth. Gold was melted, lands were reassigned, and debts quietly disappeared into royal ledgers. But beyond these visible outcomes lies a deeper loss, one that history cannot account for because it was never meant to be recovered. What was taken was not processed through public channels. It was absorbed, sealed, and removed from the reach of time itself. Objects can be returned. Institutions can be restored, but knowledge, once hidden deliberately, resists recovery. If the Templars possessed documents, relics, or evidence that challenged foundational narratives, their confiscation was not an act of preservation, but of containment. The goal was not to understand these materials, but to ensure they could never destabilize belief again. The Vatican has always defended its stewardship of history as guardianship. Yet guardianship implies eventual revelation. Here there is none. The absence of recovered Templar materials suggests finality. Whatever entered Church custody was never meant to resurface, not in medieval Europe, not in the modern age. Its value lay precisely in its disappearance. Some truths cannot be reintroduced without consequences too great to manage. Once belief systems fracture, authority follows. If early Christianity was more complex, less centralized, or less exclusive than Rome later claimed, acknowledging that would alter the Church's moral foundation. Such an admission would not merely revise doctrine, it would rewrite legitimacy. In that sense, what was taken may not be an object at all, but an alternative history, a version of the past incompatible with the present. Returning it would mean dismantling centuries of structure built upon a carefully maintained narrative. Time erodes many secrets, but some are buried too deeply to surface again. The Templars' legacy suggests that the most dangerous knowledge is not destroyed, but locked away where it cannot challenge the future. And once sealed, it becomes something history can sense, but never reclaim, leaving behind only shadows where answers should be. The story of the Knights Templar ends officially in fire and silence, yet its influence lingers in the shape of unanswered questions. What survived was not an order, a relic, or a document, but a method, the quiet management of truth. By deciding what could be known and what must remain sealed, power learned how to endure without explanation. History is shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed. The Templars' destruction taught institutions a lasting lesson. Knowledge does not need to be refuted to be neutralized. It only needs to be isolated, delayed, and fragmented until certainty dissolves into debate. In that space, authority remains intact. Across centuries, similar patterns repeat. Archives stay closed. Narratives are curated. Disruptive discoveries are reframed or postponed. This is not evidence of a single conspiracy, but of an inherited instinct. The past becomes manageable when it is incomplete. The present becomes stable when doubt is controlled. The Vatican never answered the questions surrounding the Templars because answers would invite more questions. Why such urgency? Why such secrecy? Why such permanence? Silence proved more effective than denial, allowing the Church to move forward without reopening foundations that might crack under scrutiny. For modern observers, the lesson is unsettling. If a truth once threatened power deeply enough to be buried for 700 years, then history is not a fixed record, but a negotiated one. What we inherit is shaped by choices made under fear. The most dangerous knowledge is not explosive. It is persistent. It waits in margins, in redactions, in stories that refuse to settle. The secret that shaped the fate of the Templars may never be revealed, yet its shadow endures. Not as proof, but as influence. A reminder that belief once challenged can be managed, but never fully undone. It lingers today, shaping institutions, memory, and belief, quietly steering history through absence rather than presence itself now.